thanks to SSR for organizing this workshop, because after a long time, at least I could get to listen to brilliant presentations and focus on the lockdown. And what I was asked to talk about is basically looking into the impact of lockdown. Uh, what are the differential impacts on different segments of the population? And so what I would highlight are basically two propositions. Some of these have already come into the discussion in case studies presentations. First of all, that what I would say that even if the disease and the virus has its impact on human bodies independent of their class, caste, and gender, but since human beings engage with nature, not as isolated individuals, they come together and cooperate to produce something. So it gives rise to certain relationships. And when it is a question of pandemic, these relationships get disturbed. And what I'm going to argue is this, that the structural divides that exist in capitalism in terms of caste, class, and gender or further deepened during this process of lockdown. Although I'm not going into all the issues, but I'm going to focus on that. Intervention of the ruling class uh, in order to redefine the boundaries of capitalism and also to redistribute the income and assets once again in favor of the rich. And I would say that this lockdown or a war-like emergency created that milieu, which gave the opportunity to the ruling class to do that. Now, coming to the first point, what I would suggest that if you see the data which has come up already, looking back the impact of lockdown in the past 1 year, it is not that all the segments of the population were affected uniformly. Rather, we would see that during this period of lockdown, the billionaires of the world, their wealth increased by 19% during this period. And Joseph Bezos, he became the CEO of Amazon, became the richest person of the world. If we see the tech companies like Amazon, Google, Microsoft, Facebook, Alphabet, they make huge profits during this period. And these tech companies are looking for assets across the world to invest in high-yielding, risky ventures and also even in government bonds. And during this lockdown, since one can say that e-retail has expanded, people were relying on home delivery and also using a lot of entertainment content because they were stuck at home. So during this period, we will see across the world, Amazon has recruited 175,000 employees. Fresh recruitment has happened during this period. But what is important that apart from this wealth that is being generated for the big corporates, this is also the period when the poorest of the world, they have lost 15 million US dollars worth of income every day during the pandemic. So there was a massive loss of income for the poor during this pandemic. If we look at the figures for India, we'll see that here the division is even sharper. The biggest players or you can say the billionaires of India, their wealth increased during this period by about 35%. And Mukesh Ambani became the fourth richest person in the world during this period. And during this period also, ILO reported that 40 crore workers who are in the informal sector, they are pushed farther down below the poverty line. If you consider the impact upon the middle class also, we'll see that those people who earn a monthly income above 60,000, their income loss was on an average 10%. Those people who had average monthly income less than 20,000, their income loss was on an average 37%. So even within the middle class, the lower segment, they had lost more during this pandemic compared to the upper middle class segment. So we had different impacts on different segments of the population. But I would also say that, as it was discussed in the previous session only, Dr. Rampal was, and also Dr. Deepa was mentioning, that it is important to note that a huge section of the students, they are actually got out of the education, access to education, because around 32 crores of children are affected because of the lockdown. But what is more important, that 84% of them belong to rural India. And in rural households, the access to computer is around 4%, access to internet is about 15%. So a large number of students are basically out of the education system. And a survey done by Oxfam suggests that 40% of the teachers, they reported that they are expecting that if this lockdown is prolonged, then at least one third of the students would not come back to school anymore. So a huge loss of access to education for the poorer sections of the population. And here I would say there is not much outrage, because the middle class, our kids and our children, are able to afford online education. They have laptops, they have internet connections. And just think that if the people of urban India and their children were not getting education for 1 year, what kind of protest and outrage would have happened in India? So I would also say that there is a prioritization of pains also, in the sense that what is important for public discourse and what is not. So if middle class can be managed, then the rest of the people who had lost this access to education, that can be completely invisibilized. And that has happened also in this period of lockdown. But I would also say that if we see that what are the segments which did better and what are the segments which are really affected, one can easily understand that the circuit of capital, which is MCM dash, where you want to increase capital and that should be mediated by a process of production, that has collapsed, because this is a society of producing exchange values. Even if you have produced, if you are not able to sell, if you are not able to exchange, then the goods which have been produced, their values also lose out over time. So because of this, most of the productive sectors were affected, and a lot of job loss happened and production collapsed. But we should also need to see that there is the other circuit, which does not require a mediation to production, which is known as the FIRE sectors, the M2M dash circuit, the financial sector, finance, insurance, real estate, and business service. They actually did well during this period. The profit increased. And this is precisely the reason you will find that even in the lockdown, when there was a collapse of production, but stock prices increased for quite a few months. So these are the segments which actually were affected, and the financial sector actually could sail through, and huge profits were made during this process. And these are sectors where actually no value is being produced. It is the sector of extraction of rents. So those are the segments which could survive, because we have a particular kind of capitalism where much of the appropriation of profit is happening in the financial sector, while the real productive sector actually got affected during the lockdown. But I would also say that this lockdown and this situation also gives a sense that what kind of technological developments we are having, and the division between mental labor and physical labor, which exists in a class society and which is also deepened in capitalism, that was quite visible during this period, according to me. Who are the people who could afford to work from home? Basically, those who were involved in some kind of mental labor, the people who can communicate from a distance, because we have that technology. And that technology evolved through human civilization, where you can easily communicate and transact using internet and laptop. but where the kind of production which requires physical cooperation, where you have to work together and produce something, these are the people who are most affected. And there you do not have the option. You cannot say that I'm not going to work because their salaries were not protected like ours. And so they had the choice that either you have to fight with the virus or you have to lose your livelihood. So we see a sharp divide between how technology favors different kind of work. And not only that, there was a criminalization of the poor people during this period of time. Those who actually cooperate and produce something, these people were seen as the spreaders of coronavirus. We all know how migrants were treated in Delhi, in Mumbai, in Chennai, major urban centers of India. And we see politicians saying that they are the super spreaders. We see that how congestion and people staying at slums were considered to be that they are the cause of the spread of coronavirus, as if they have chosen to stay in these congested slums. So what I see that there was a clear divide between how not only the pandemic affected different segments of the population, but also how these effects were recognized, how these effects were appreciated, and how these effects were seen by public in the public domain and public discourse. Now, coming to the next point, which I want to highlight, is this: that if we see, and it has come in the discussion even in yesterday's presentation, but I would like to highlight a little bit more, because if we see the pre-pandemic situation, what was the major trends? If we do not go into the details of different countries, but largely capitalism was facing a stagnation in terms of productivity growth. It was facing a stagnation in terms of real wage. It faced a stagnation also in terms of private corporate investment. And this was happening even before the pandemic. This was happening in a situation when capitalism was trying to resolve this question of slowing down of productivity growth by using new technology. So even if artificial intelligence, Internet of Things, or robotics were being introduced, but what is well known as solo paradox, it says that the productivity growth has slowed down in advanced capitalist countries, even with the use of these technologies. Now, some people argue that artificial intelligence has not emerged to be a general purpose technology the way it happened in case of electricity or dynamo, and it will take time. So we'll get the full benefit of these new technologies after a certain period of time. But what it would happen after some years, we will see. But till now, these technologies could not resolve the stagnation of productivity growth in advanced capitalist countries. Now, if we see what was the other remedy that capitalist countries and the policymakers try to introduce in order to solve this problem. The other problem was the quantitative easing and relaxation in monetary policies. You reduce the interest rates and increase the debt. And by that, in advanced capitalist countries, you create certain wealth effect, which at least temporarily can displace the demand problem. But at the same time, there was asset inflation taking place, and at the same time, interest rates were low. Now, even if the interest rate came down, but that also could not generate the adequate investment from the private sector. So that also couldn't take care of the problem. Now, because of that, the economists in advanced countries, particularly in UK and USA and Eurozone, there was an expectation that not only capitalism could get out of the crisis of the previous financial crisis fully, rather, there was an inverted yield curve, so returns from short-term bonds were higher than the long-term bonds, and economists were predicting this as a situation of impending crisis. What they suggested that there could be once again a plunge to a crisis in 2022. Now, in this context, what Robert Brenner argued that the capitalists have come together, created an oligarchy, an oligarchy of financiers, central bank on the one hand, on the other hand, corporate bosses, and also the political elite who need to intervene and who they decided to intervene in order to redistribute the assets in favor of the rich once again. So it was required that you require to intervene, and in neoliberal regime, if you say that state intervention is a myth, that withdrawal of the state is actually a myth. So there was state intervention, and they were looking for opportunities for state intervention. And this is the reason why we see authoritarian governments in different parts of the world. And what I suggest that lockdown gave an opportunity for this kind of intervention in different parts of the world, including India, where there was a kind of intervention to redistribute assets in favor of the rich. Now, let us see what is happening, what happened during this period. And we all know, but still we need to remember and recollect what happened during this period in these lives. Now, if we see that this pandemic created a crisis, of course, and like every capitalist crisis, the state comes in the aid of the big corporates, bail them out. And the corporates also know that even if debts increase, the government would bail out when it is required. And when they're financed by the government, that also gives them the advantage to buy up the smaller rivals who actually are not able to sustain during this period of crisis. So concentration of capital increases that happened also in this kind of a pandemic, because the small get decimated because they do not have the big pockets and could not sustain for a long time, not having their goods being produced and selling in the market. So there was a concentration. Of course, it has increased during this period of time. What is even more important, and this has been mentioned, that we see the redefining of the boundaries of capitalism, which I want to say this is nothing but primitive accumulation of capital. And this primitive accumulation of capital is, according to what David Harvey said, that it is accumulation through disposition, where you require to create fresh release of assets. And so assets should go from non-owners to owners, and you have to redefine the assets in a manner which can be traded and which can be used for speculation. But Prabhat Patnaik says that accumulation through encroachment, that kind of accumulation I also see during this period, which is nothing but income deflation, where petty producers are decimated. We see privatization of public assets. All these are happening. And even if you see what Farshad Arighi talks about accumulation through displacement, which is nothing but under the production of labor and nature during this period of time, that is also happening. So all these features are basically features of primitive accumulation of capital. So where capital requires to push the boundaries because it cannot maintain the rate of profit through its earlier boundaries, so it has to extend its limits. It has to encroach non-capital space and destroy which are not capital relations or bring them into capital relations. So this has also happened, and we see that privatization was happening, and the government took the opportunity to privatize and talk about disinvestment in insurance. We see that BPCL, which is a profit-making oil company, and this is the second largest oil company in our country, publicly owned, which has a market share of 22% in domestic market. And they are planning to sell them to Vedanta, who have bought some oil fields in Rajasthan and want them to refined in BPCL refineries, and they also have to share a part of their market to these private corporates. So this is happening. We see that privatization of banks that has been proposed during this period. So all these moves are basically creating assets which can be traded in the financial sectors. So financialization of existing resources, which were earlier publicly owned, are being transformed into private assets during this period of time. We also see that during this period of time, 11 states, they say that labor laws need to be relaxed. labor code was tabled in the parliament. And also these states were saying that working hours should be increased from 8 hours to 12 hours. Working days should be increased from, say, 6 hours, 6 days in a week, which was completely a violation of ILO norms. Of course, a petition was filed in the Supreme Court and then they had to withdraw. But I believe that even legally it has been withdrawn in some states, but in practice, there is a social sanction in the society that you require to do all these things in order to recover our economy, in order to get our growth rates once again. And so all these are required. So you create a social sanction for all these kinds of move, which the government is trying to do during this period of time. So I'd end by saying, so this is a legitimization of this intervention of the capitalist class that happened during this period of time. But I would also say that there were alternatives proposed not only by the left economists or those who are opposing government policies, but even if we see, even the PMO suggested that in order to recover the economy, what we can do in the meantime, for at least temporarily, that we can increase the income tax rates up to 40% for those who are earning an income more than 1 crore a year. It was also proposed that the wealth tax can be reintroduced. And an estimate suggests that if we consider the biggest 954 richest persons in our country and introduce a 4% wealth tax to them, it will generate a revenue which is equivalent to 1% of our GDP, which is exactly the amount which the government said that we have spent a lot of money for this stimulus package. But they didn't do that. These suggestions which came from the PMO were also not accepted by the government. What they basically tried to do is to further uh, uh, proceed with the neoliberal reforms. And this is nothing but authoritarianism in disguise, which is reflected in different political sphere as well. But what is also important, that it is not market and it is not about just releasing the powers of market to decide and distribute, but it is simply an authoritarian move by the ruling class, taking the advantage of this abnormal situation where you try to redistribute the assets in favor of the rich. So once again, I would say that this lockdown, the biggest, for the people who are the most affected, who lost the most, are the poor and the lower middle class. And once again, if you see the policies which have been adopted by the government, they also are supposed to take the biggest brunt of these, or the burden of these policies in order to recover this economy. So they had to face the pains, and also in the future, they have to take the greatest burden. And here I stop.